Hi, everyone, and welcome to Session 2 of the Furman Prison Education Partnership's inaugural speaker series, Behind and Beyond Bars, Perspectives on the U.S. Prison System. I'm Laura Morris, and I, along with Sally Morris-Cody, co-direct FPEP, short for Furman Prison Education Partnership. During tonight's program, we invite you to participate by submitting your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Toward the end of the program, Furman student Elizabeth Ortiz will ask our speaker a few of your questions. Before I hand it over to Furman student Ali Hermetz to introduce tonight's speaker, I want to give a brief introduction of FPEP. FPEP launched in 2018 with two goals. First, to bring transformative higher education opportunities to university students, incarcerated students, and students recently released from prison, bringing them into classrooms together as equals to engage in dialogue and to learn from people with whom they might not otherwise interact. Second, FPEP aims, through events like this one, to inform thought and action in the Furman community around issues of mass incarceration and reentry. Through our student group on campus, we offer students opportunities to engage with, learn from, and support incarcerated students at our partner institution, Perry Correctional, a prison in Pelzer, South Carolina. If you are interested in learning more about FPEP or becoming involved in our work, please email us at fpep@furman.edu. In the new year, we'll have an official FPEP website on Furman's site, which will house videos of our speaker series, as well as answers to questions we're unable to get to during the Q&A period. Please keep your eye out for it. Now, I am happy to welcome one of Furman's students involved in FPEP, Ali Hermetz, to introduce our speaker for tonight. Ali?
Today, we are pleased to host a discussion with Heather Matthews, a 25-year veteran employee of the Bryan Federal Prison Camp, which is a minimum security prison for women in Bryan, Texas. Matthews is a third-generation Federal Bureau of Prisons employee and was the first woman in her family to work for the prison system. Through her years at Bryan, Matthews brought creativity and expertise to a variety of roles, which included cook supervisor, unit secretary, and recreational specialist, as well as male-dominated roles such as safety manager, just to name a few. In her time at Bryan, Matthews was able to gain a perspective on life inside prison and on factors that influence incarceration and recidivism that many people outside the prison system are not aware of. Furman Prison Education Partnership is excited for this opportunity to learn about what goes on inside from a former employee, and we're glad you are here to join us for this discussion. And now, please join me in welcoming Heather Matthews.
Hello, everybody.
Hi, Heather. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. So everyone, as Ali shared with us, Heather had a long career with the Federal Bureau of Prisons and is here today to tell us about it. She worked at Bryan Federal Prison Camp, which currently holds 566 incarcerated women, but held as many as 900 during Heather's tenure. While many who work within the prison facility are considered a corrections officer, the roles you can hold within that title are many and varied. As Ali shared, Heather held a number of those different positions herself over the course of her career. I'm going to ask Heather some questions about these roles and about the prison over the next 40 minutes before turning to your questions. So, Heather, to jump off, you began working at Bryan Federal Prison Camp when you were 22 years old as a cook supervisor. Yes. Can you tell us what that job entails and how you cycle through 900 incarcerated women for 3 meals each day, which just seems completely overwhelming to me?
Right. So in that position, you have an industrial kitchen. So you teach the offenders how to use all the equipment, how to bulk quantity cook. So you'll take, it's the Army recipe cards. It's kind of the system they used way back in the beginning. Mm-hmm. So if you had a population of 900 and the recipe card was set up for 100, you'd have to figure out, okay, well, all 900 offenders are not going to eat. So you figure out the percentage of the population. You have to, even for bread or baking, you have to figure out all the increments, how much you're going to need for each thing. And then same thing, said how to use all the equipment, like the dish machine, the ovens, all the chemicals. We constantly gave the offenders training on safety and different aspects of the kitchen. And then on top of that, you know, when they would come over, because we had a coffee hour, which was really breakfast. And then we had lunch and we had dinner. But on the weekend, it was coffee hour, brunch, which was breakfast, and then dinner. But back in the beginning, when I first started, we had the ICC female boot camp. So you would feed your kitchen workers first, because you would check them in and make sure everybody showed up for work, and give them their assignments and make sure everything was covered, shifts, kind of like working in a restaurant, make sure everything was covered. Then the female, once we got all that cleaned up and set up, then the female boot camp would come in. And there was 2 teams, and their offenders over there served their own. They had no contact. Once they went to the boot camp, they had no contact with the population on the other side.
And so I'm going to interrupt you real quick. Everybody, we're going to jump into more about the boot camp later. So don't worry if you're saying, well, what is the boot camp? So go on, Heather. And
so they would do that. And then once all that cleared, then we would start feeding the housing units. And they would call them in order based on the institutional duty officer, whoever won the cleanest housing unit for that week. They would call them in that order, and we would feed them. And sometimes you'd have somebody complain, but in general, I mean, we did a lot. In the beginning, we didn't have a national menu. So we were able to create the menu based off our population and likes and needs of our population. And then I think it was 2016, maybe, yeah. Somewhere they went to the National Menu Bureau-wide. It saved a lot of money and it made it simpler. But then you did not have as much as far as, oh, you know, do a fried chicken, because they went from where you could, if you have baked chicken, and going to the national menu, it was more healthy, more baked up, away from fryers, which that's understandable. But it kind of, but same thing. Originally, we used to bake and make everything. Every meal, it seemed like, had a dessert. When they went to the national menu, it got rid of a lot of that. So it was more of like holiday meals that you would have a dessert. And same thing, when I first started, they had soda machines. When they went to the national menu, they got rid of all the soda machines. Okay. So you had coffee, tea, and water, and they would get milk. But it changed a lot. But it was a great opportunity to teach a whole bunch of people skills that you could go out and have your own catering business. You could work in a restaurant. You could manage or work in a hotel in the catering part or the food service part. And some women they wanted to learn how to cook, or it kept them busy. So of course, then you always had the ones that didn't want to be in food service, because that's one requirement is, and I can't speak for the state prison system, but it's a requirement that everyone has to go into the kitchen and work for a certain period of time, unless they are exempt for some reason. But it's a great life skill. Everybody has to eat. So if you don't know how to cook, you'll learn.
No, that's fantastic.
And you have to also too, like, you know, substitutions. If for some reason you go to cook spaghetti and your pasta is full of bugs and your warehouse is closed and you do not have any more pasta, but you might have elbow macaroni, you could change it and make chili mac, or you have to get creative, because the substitution normally is a starch for a starch or a vegetable for a vegetable. It just depends on, you know, whatever the menu is. But sometimes you have to get a little creative. But I absolutely loved food service. I
remember you said that you would work there off and on for years.
Yes, they pulled me throughout my entire career of 25 years into the kitchen. No matter where I was at, they always pulled me back.
But I know you liked it. So, but actually teaching the women some of these skills in the kitchen brings me right into the next question. So when I worked with you, which I worked, for those of you who don't know, I worked at Bryan Federal Prison Camp for 2 years while I was doing my PhD. I worked with Heather when she was a recreation specialist. And that meant, Heather, that you were in charge of creating and leading classes in crafting, reading, and other areas. Can you tell us about the programming opportunities that you offered the women who were incarcerated at Bryan?
So there was 4 recreational specialists. At the time, I was the only female. And so I did the leisure. There's a wellness part and there's a leisure part. And I did the leisure part. And I got paid to do exactly what I love. So we had ceramics. I had numerous beading classes, beginning beading and more advanced beading. We had card making. We had Zentangle, which is when you just draw all these different shapes and colors. It's great. It's very therapeutic. We had Fimo, which if anyone's familiar with the Fimo clay, and they would wrap it around pins. We had like little easy bake ovens, and they would cook those. They would also bead around pins. We had the book club I started. We had the artist in residency program that was creative writing that was started. We had plastic canvas. I had about 50 classes, and every month I averaged half the population in completions and programming. And I always tried to find different things. We had knitting, we had crochet. Crochet, when I first got there, was a big deal. Knitting wasn't as big, and then knitting really took off. I personally am a knitter, so it was, like I said, it was just great. But everyone in a population of even 600 offenders, people have talent. Some people have talent they don't even know that they have. And when they discover it while incarcerated, or they bring it with them when they're incarcerated, to get them to share that talent. I actually taught a class on how to market and sell your hobby craft items. A lot of the women would send them home to their children and loved ones and things, but you might not necessarily get rich off of it, but you can generate a small income off of it. So, now they have the world of Etsy. So you don't have to pay for a booth fee. You pay a percentage of your sales, but, we went through of how to price and market your product and how to sell it. And it's, an extra income. But I mean, it was just unbelievable, some of the stuff these ladies would make. We did one that was trash treasures, where you basically took trash and you made recyclable products out of it, whether they wrapped binders or notebooks or folded paper and made flowers. It was just amazing. And I did that for quite a few years. I kind of got to the point where I had done so much. I was happy, but I needed more of a challenge. The girls didn't want me to leave rec.
Yeah, of course. You offered so many classes.
Right?
Yeah.
Yes.
But
Yes.
I know you left there for the end of your career, but will you tell us a little bit, and you started to answer this, about why are recreation classes so important? What do they do for these women?
It's therapeutic. They calm you down. They use a different, creativity uses a different part of your brain. Like I said, some women didn't even realize that like they could knit or crochet or bead, or then they would get creative where it was, beads and knitting. I mean, they flourished, and we had drawing and painting. And I know in psychology, they use some of that to help tell their story or for therapeutic reasons. But for us over there, it was kind of a safe place. The women could come over there, create, like I said, different groups of inmates that normally would not associate with each other. It didn't matter back there. They would sit, they would talk, they would help each other. I never had a fight back there.
Wow.
Thank heavens. But they all helped each other. And like I said, they would ask questions, and then I would get some of the ladies that would help teach other classes, or, they always made sure that it was, because if because that was a good place to hide contraband, they had lockers that were issued. I would have to go through the lockers just to check for contraband, which that's standard in any prison. You always do shakedowns. But, you know, if it got bad back there, they would shut it down. So that was, and they didn't want that shut down. I mean, we were even back in that building sometimes, a lot of times with no air. Do you remember that?
Oh, I remember that. And for those of you who, Heather and I are picturing this place. She had this building that was far back in, away from some of the other areas of the prison compound. And it was this huge room where the women had these long tables and could make stuff. And yeah, it would have been a great place to hide things, but anytime you're hiding things, you're bringing contraband in, that area is going to get shut down. But I do love that in all that time, recreation always stayed open because the women were invested in it.
Oh, they were. I mean, we might have been sweating to death, but we were back there. We were back there crafting, and, you know, like the card making, that was packets we pre-put together for all the major holidays, you know, like Easter, Christmas, Valentine's, Halloween. For them to make cards for their kids or loved ones, and especially if you didn't have any money, we had all sorts of fun stuff, and it was endless creativity, because we had the fun scissors to make the edge pattern, and we had some stickers, and we had lots of glitter. Women love glitter and they used to everything. But we just had a great time. Like I said, you'd hear everybody laughing and talking, and sometimes we'd play music back there. It just depended on what was going on, but it was a great place for them. It was stress-free.
Yeah, I love how you called it a safe space. And so can you tell us about the women who are incarcerated? Brian, you've mentioned their past as being traumatic when we've talked in the past. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, psychology would always tell us it was between 80 and 85% of the population had some sort of trauma, whether it was sexual, physical, or mental abuse. Over the years, I did have lots of women that confided in me with their stories, and it was just absolutely daunting how traumatic. I mean, you see stuff on TV, movies, and you're thinking, you know, okay, that's fake, but some of that stuff really happens to people. And that was one thing, you know, when you're dealing with offenders, you don't know their story. They're going to tell you part of their story of what they want you to know, but you really don't know anybody, whether they're an offender or not, their whole story. And so being a female, working with a female offender is one thing. If I was a male working with a female offender and for some reason I got really loud, or I came up on you and you had suffered trauma of abuse, that might cause you to flip and you attack me. So you just don't know what that person has been through. And so, you know, I used to not really joke, but I would tell people it's really easy to wind up in prison. It really is. Anybody can wind up in prison. Everybody here is paying their debt to society. That doesn't mean you demean them or you talk ugly to them. We're supposed to help them, make them better, make sure they're safe, they're getting the health care they need. Our job is not to make them, break them down and make them feel bad. So I always felt like I made a difference. I hope I made a difference. You know, sometimes I did say some things to some staff that said some stuff I felt was inappropriate. But I did have a lot of inmates that did come and confide in me with their personal business. I did have an inmate that worked for me that I did find out she passed away after she had left. So that was a little hard.
Yeah, you get to know these women. In the years I was there, I taught the creative writing classes that Heather was talking about, and these women would often share stories of things that broke my heart, but also things that I've never had to confront in my own life. And yeah, I always thought, wow, yeah, I can see the trajectory you were on before you ever got here.
And I would have some that would call me, and every time they would call me, I would have to do a memo because that's required and turn it in. But I would
Once they were released?
Yes.
Yeah.
So
okay.
even if I even if they were out on a furlough in the community or I ran into them somewhere, you're supposed to write a memo, because that way, if anything comes back, you've already reported it. But I would have a lot of the ladies that worked for me specifically would call and tell me, thank you, thank you, thank you. And they tell me what they were doing. I had one that was an assistant manager of like a Dollar Tree. And because of the training I gave her when I was the safety manager, that's what helped her move up and do that. And so that, I almost felt like a proud mom.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, so, because I've always, in my life, I've always learned, and I've always cross-trained anywhere I've worked, because that makes you more marketable, and hopefully not the first person. If they start laying people off, you won't be the first person to let go. So I always, even in the kitchen, anywhere I worked, I would always have the ladies cross-trained.
Mm-hmm.
That way, you know exactly, you know, you can do that, you can do this, you can do that.
But then it offers them opportunities when they get out.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
it
because
does.
the women there, because this is a minimum security prison, I'm remembering that the average sentence was 12 years.
Yes.
So these women could expect to rejoin society, and many much shorter than that. So they could expect to rejoin society, and they have to have something to do.
Yeah.
But let's switch to talk about recidivism a little bit. So recidivism is when people leave prison and then end up re-offending or breaking some rules and ending up back in prison. So we've talked about two programs in the past that were meant to reduce recidivism, Brian. One that you've already brought up is the boot camp.
Yes.
And the other is RDAP, the Residential Drug and Alcohol Program, which was still there when I was there. Could you tell it? Okay, awesome. So could you tell us about both the boot camp and about RDAP?
So the female boot camp, it was set up as a team A and a team B. Mm-hmm. It was 60 inmates in each team. Every 60 days, a new team came over, because it was a 6-month program. So in the middle, it was every 90 days you had a team graduating and bringing kind of another team over. The way it kind of kept going, it was constant movement. Mm-hmm. They had to program, that was required. Mm-hmm. So they worked on their education. So like if team A stayed in a program, then team B would go out. They mitigated the forest. They would pick up trash. So they learned how to use, like cutting tools to cut tree branches. They learned to use lawnmowers and weed eaters. And they would come in and they were so sweaty and stinky. But they learned to work, that was hard labor. That's hard work. Mm-hmm. Then the next day, the opposite team would go out, and the other team that went out would then program. And then at 60 days or 96 months, they would have a graduation, because I was in charge of all of that. It was a group of us that did it, but I was the unit secretary. So I was the one doing all the release paperwork. Mm-hmm. And so it was a lot of work. Trying to get all the packets signed, and routed and all that fun stuff. But it was very good. The recidivism rate, if I remember right, was less than 3% with that program. And they ran it like a boot camp. The inmates had sued. So originally, the male boot camp for the federal prison system was open first. And the females didn't have one. Mm-hmm. And they filed and they won. So Bryan was the only federal prison for females, or federal prison, that had the female boot camp. Mm-hmm. When the war kicked off and 9/11 happened and all that kicked off, they cut money, and that was a program that was cut. And it mm-hmm. was very sad, because that program had a less recidivism rate.
Yeah.
It really kind of, I guess in a sense, did break down the inmate offender, but it built them up. It made them stronger. It made them more confident. We had some women, we had this one inmate, she lost like 80 pounds.
Wow.
So, but they learned how to exercise. They learned how to work. They learned how to time manage. They were given more education. They were giving medical care. They were giving counseling. We had a ropes course, which is like an obstacle course mm-hmm. that they did. I did it once. I'm scared of heights. It for me. But they loved it. And like I said, it was like they conquered their fear. And one thing I learned from the gentleman that taught that course, when you apparently have had something traumatic happen, you, like when I got up on the high angle element, my body just totally, because I had fallen when I was young from a high sand dune.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like my body remembered that trauma, and there wasn't anything I could do. So that was part of that program, was to help them conquer that fear. So I do roller coasters, and I do all sorts of stuff now, trying to get
to do what they were doing. That is fantastic. So,
I do.
So that one sounds like it was a really great program.
It was phenomenal, and I really don't think that should have been taken away.
Yeah. So,
and then the RDAP and with the boot camp, you had to be a first-time offender.
Okay, so that was the qualifying part, that
Yes,
you have to be
a first-time offender.
Okay.
With RDAP, I don't know their exact recidivism rate. I know it was higher than the boot camp. I know you have to get down to a certain length of your sentence to get into RDAP. Like you have to be, I'm just making up, let's say you're 18 months short of your sentence, then you could qualify. But to qualify, that one, you do not have to be a first-time offender, but you have to have, you have to be able to prove that you have an addiction or you were a drug user. And with a lot of these women, because of the trauma, they were addicted to drugs or alcohol or gambling or some addiction, because that helped numb what they don't want to remember.
Yeah, and that
they want to confront.
Yeah, did it matter if that addiction was a part of why they offended or why they committed a crime, or was this just they needed to be? Okay.
No, I mean, basically when you get sentenced, the judge looks at what are the parameters. Like, okay, for this offense, you're, let's say, a first-time offender or you're a second-time offender. They look at, for that crime, it might be a 13-month to a 48-month sentence. So he or she has to figure out, okay, how much time I'm going to give this person.
Yeah.
And I mean, we had some women that they had 29-year sentences.
Yeah.
Now they usually went to a higher level and they would come down. But
higher level would be a medium security,
right?
And then they'd come down to a camp.
Or they would go to a female FCI over time, because there's a point system, scoring system, and they had good behavior. Then they would come down to us at the camp, especially if there was the RDAP, or there was, like, we had at Bryan some of the highest education programs. So you'd have some inmates that would transfer just for our education programs, because we have phenomenal teachers and staff in education there that, I mean, it was almost like a college campus, between the food and then the people that cared and took care of business and education. I mean, it was awesome.
Because I remember there was of course the GED courses that anyone without a high school education was required to spend up to 2 years until they got their GED. And then there were classes from the local community college, so you could get certified in HVAC or a few other.
There's horticulture, you had cosmetology, they had courses for office management and medical coding.
Yes, I remember this. So there were a lot of opportunities there. And just so everybody knows, a lot of state institutions do not have this. This is something that's available at the federal level. And here in South Carolina, it definitely is not. We don't have those availabilities, especially at the prison where we're partnering, Perry Correctional. That's not happening there. It was, it's always been a shock for me, because Bryan was the first prison I worked at. And then to move to other places and to talk to people in other places and to hear that most prisons do not have that kind of programming that can really help people.
And that's so unfortunate, because I personally feel if they can get the mental health therapy they need, if they can have the education, whether it's college or even a trade school, they're not going to come back, because they can go out and find a job or create their own company or do something. But when they don't have any of that, that causes them to come back.
That's when they, yeah. So that actually leads me pretty directly into the next question. So you've talked about how sometimes even it doesn't, like some of these women were really helped by the programming opportunities, but sometimes regardless of programming, regardless of anything, some of the women would be released and end up reincarcerated multiple times. What happened in those cases? How did you make sense of them?
So for some women, for example, that were in the RDAP program, they were given, I want to say it was 6 months faster to the halfway house. They got 6 months off, basically. Now, if you violate your sentence of any kind, then you have to finish that. They send you back. But some of them just wanted the time off. They're like, it was awful. I'm not programming. I'm not doing that. I just say what they want to hear. And, I just want the time off. But then there were some ladies that they needed that. And their whole personality, their look on life, it changed. It changed them. It bettered them. And they didn't come back. But then you have the other ones that they'd come through, back, and I wasn't surprised, and it was sad. I used to always tell them, I can always go get another job. You would make my day. If we had no one incarcerated, I'll go find another job. But you always had some that came back repeatedly, and it's like, did you miss us that much? Do you like it here that much? But we had some, they were homeless. They had nothing to go back to. Now, something they started several years before I retired. They had a staff member that would help. They'd help write resumes for the girls, because like those people don't write a resume, or they don't have one, or they've never written one. They would help write a resume. I know they would help them find, if they were homeless, a place that they could go to, or if they had nothing, no clothes, nothing. There was lots of opportunity, and I don't know that the state prisons did that, but the federal prison system did that, and that helped tremendously. They even used to have a kiosk that they could go in to where they were going, and it would pull up all the jobs in the area they were going to. So, that was something new that had started. But all prisons should be that way, where there's education. That is the biggest thing, education and mental health.
And unfortunately, that's neither of those is available widespread. No. And sometimes people will call the federal prison system club fed, just because it has those sorts of opportunities, because it's also, even as we talk about funding, the system losing funding, it's still better funded than most state institutions.
Correct.
So, yeah. Now, when something bad happens in prison, like 9/11, or a long-term COVID lockdown, which we know is happening at prisons across the US right now, or even the death of an incarcerated woman's family, how do you deal with that in prison? What resources are available to them?
They always can use psychology services. All the staff are supposed to monitor. When you have incarcerated people that are around you all the time, whether you're working a housing unit or they work for you somewhere on the compound, you get to know them. You get to kind of know their personality, their moods. When they come in, they might have just called home and it wasn't good. And so I always made it a point to try to, pull them into my office, or pull them off where obviously there wasn't other ears, and say, hey, are you okay? What's going on? Or they would show up crying. And I'd be like, okay, come with me. Tell me about it. So it's a stress level for everybody, staff, inmates. Like I said, they can go to psychology services, but it's a little different. We can leave and go home. They can't.
Yep. The chaplain who we work with at the prison in Pelzer, he has said, prison is a trauma. It's a constant trauma, because you're stuck there and you're being traumatized again and again. So there are psychological services, but they don't get to leave.
It's hard. It's you can call home. They have, I don't know about the state, but the federal, it's like Skype, but it's a little different. you know, they have those opportunities, which is great, but
Yeah.
same thing. If something major happens, like your child dies or is murdered, or your mom or dad passes away, or your husband, or something major, you can't leave. So you're trying to, especially from a female perspective, if you're a mom, you're trying to parent through a phone.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's just not the same.
I remember
Plus the ladies, I mean, you know, when you're a parent and you're female, whether, I guess you're a male or a female, females tend to be more maternal, not saying men aren't, but it gets hard because your kids are mad at you.
Yeah. No,
There's lots of things that being incarcerated as an offender that you're going to have to deal with when you get home with your kids. What if your kids, let's say you had 4 children, all by different men as a woman, and they all wound up in the foster care system because all the dads were incarcerated or nobody wanted them. So then your kids are spread out. You don't know where they're at. Yep. Same thing, you know, with the offender that's a male. You don't know where your kids are at, or you might not have contact with your kids. So that is a stressor. So there's always constant stressors.
Yeah, no, and I remember a lot of women coming to me and telling me how helpless they felt because there were things happening with their kids and they had no control.
Nope.
And they had to learn, to give up that control, which you never want to do when you see your child struggling. But there's literally nothing they can do there. So that was always heartbreaking to me. So we're approaching the holiday season. Many of us are questioning whether we're even going to get to spend time with our extended families during COVID. I'm still trying to figure this out myself. Tell us about holidays in prison. Is there special food? Are there special activities? Gifts? Can they send gifts home? What's going on with prison?
Yes, so food service always does holiday meals. That's separate from the national menu. So they'll create, you know, a special meal, which usually the girls out there in the kitchen, that kept them busy. They loved it. They would have different things out in recreation. We would have movie nights, so we could do Christmas movies. They cannot watch certain rated movies, so but we would do like movies. We did the card making. You did different hobby craft items. So they can do hobby craft and they can mail it home. They have to pay for the postage, but they can mail that home to their families. And so usually the increase in hobby craft items occurred for that time period. But you try to keep them busy. They were decorating the housing units, and we would have a contest. I think they got away from that.
Okay.
But you try to keep everybody busy. You know, I would always bring my little tree and set it up, and we'd decorate back in hobbycraft, or we decorated down in safety. We decorated in food service and set up a tree and played Christmas music. So we tried to make it jolly, or the holidays, we tried to make them, because like for Veterans Day, we would do either burgers and hot dogs. So they get a hot dog and a burger, and we would serve watermelon during the middle of the day, like on the weekend, that's how it went. And they could go eat outside or come in the kitchen. They always try to keep them very involved and busy, because their depression and other mental issues are the worst around Thanksgiving on, because of all the holidays and not being with their family. And it's just really hard, which I totally understand. You can't leave. So you're stuck there. And of course, all of us get to go home. So
yeah. I mean, a lot of us are worried about like this year, oh no, what if we can't? But this is for many women. If the average sentence is 12 years, that's 12 years of no holidays with your family.
Well, and think about it. You're incarcerated for 12 years. In 12 years, look at how many different smartphones changed. Yes. Look at if you had 12 years and there wasn't cell phones, and you come out after 12 years and there's a cell phone and an iPad, and you have no idea what that is.
Yep. I remember women asking me, like, what's your cell phone like now? I'm getting out soon.
Yeah.
Is it, and of course, for everybody, you don't carry a cell phone in the prison. You leave
No.
your personal effects in your car, or you leave them at home. So so they really just did not see these things for years. And how do you make sense of a world that's changed?
That's right. It's totally different. Totally
Mhm.
different.
Now, when we talked last week, you mentioned the imbalance of the number of people incarcerated in a prison and the number of officers who are there.
Yes.
What are those numbers and how do you think of those?
So normally, just to give an example, you might have 108 staff, but the population might be anywhere from 600 to 900 offenders.
Mm-hmm.
So you're always outnumbered. And the inmates, they let you, I guess in a sense, police them or manage them, because at any given time, they could totally take over the prison. But if you look, it's structure. What do they have? Yes, it's awful because you don't have privacy, you don't have your own room, you can't leave, but you have routine and you have structure. Some of it's positive, some of it might not be. Some of it, I really believe it can be, the staff's attitude. I think if you come in and you're in a bad mood, then that might change the mood of the people you're around. Or if you're happy, then that changes the mood, the way you treat somebody, the way they'll treat you. I know, because she mentioned I'm a third generation. I know my father one time had an offender come up to him and tell him, "You're going to be sick tomorrow." And my dad kind of looked at him. He goes, "You're going to be sick tomorrow," which that meant that there was going to be a riot. Something was fixing to go down, but they respected my father and they wanted to make sure he was okay. Mm-hmm. So, it's just, I always try to treat people the way I want to be treated. And I would hope, because we did have some staff that, if you have a medical emergency, it might be an offender that's beside you that they're not supposed to touch your radio, but sometimes that happens because that staff member might be passed out or having a heart attack and they can't talk.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like that relationship between the incarcerated people and the staff is really important.
Yes, I mean, there's that line, and the offenders and the staff, you have to know there's that line, but you still, if you respect and you treat them all the same, I feel like you get respect. It's when you degrade them and you treat them, because I've heard this before, like they're caged animals, or they're not human, basically. Well, yeah, they are. And that's why I always just say anybody can break the law. It's really easy to wind up in prison. It's what you do. So you're paying your debt to society. That's why they're here. Now, while you're in there, make yourself better, do better, figure out why are you here? What brought you here? And when you leave, please don't come back. Yeah. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed helping you, and I hope I made a difference, but, I really didn't want to see any of them come back.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I remember the heartbreak.
And I did. I had one, she had been gone for 13 years, and I was in the kitchen, and she hollered at me. She's like, "Miss Matthews." And I turned around, and I looked at her, and she looked the same. And her and I talked for a long time, and she said, "It was nothing that y'all did. Y'all made me better, but I just screwed up."
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, and this is something you keep saying, is that it's easy to get into prison. And I think that's something a lot of us don't think about. But I remember talking to some of the women there, and I was like, wow, I know people who have, and this is like, sometimes it is just, they end up there. And I'm not saying that everybody's has done something that is worthy of getting them in prison, but sometimes it felt like, wow, that could have been people I know, that could have been a friend of mine, that could have been, yeah.
I mean, it could be your best friend that, just something happens that, and it doesn't go good, and they wind up, they have to go to prison.
Mm-hmm. Yep. It's that one mistake can change your life forever. Yep.
That's why I always used to tell them, always do the right thing when nobody's watching, because somebody's always watching.
Yes. Yes, somebody is always watching, especially in prison. So,
yes.
Heather, it's 5:45. We have 15 minutes left, and I've been watching questions come in again and again. I have not been reading them, but I am curious to turn this over to the students because I think they have a lot of questions for you. So I'm going to turn this over to Elizabeth Ortiz, who will ask questions that have come in from the audience. Elizabeth.
Hi, Heather. Thank you for that interesting and informative discussion. My name is Elizabeth Ortiz, and I'm a senior and a member of the FPEP student group. We would like to spend the last 15 minutes of our time with you tonight taking questions from our audience. So jumping right into the first one, so earlier in the presentation, you talked about how women can use their experience in the kitchen to work in restaurants or hotel catering services after their time being incarcerated. Realistically, how likely are these women to get a job in these fields with a criminal record? And are there any specific resources to help those who are previously incarcerated with unemployment?
Food service is one of the easiest jobs as a ex-offender to get a job in. The only area that it might be a little harder is in management, in that depending on the company you work for, it could be on a case-by-case basis. They would look at what your crime is, I guess. But I know when I did restaurant management prior to going to work for the federal prison system, most people that worked under me, and I was an assistant manager, were all ex-felons.
Gotcha. Okay, so our next one, what kind of services would be available to inmates who are practicing members of faiths other than Christianity? For example, would accommodations be made for a Muslim prisoner who needed certain types of clothing and a clean space for prayer?
Yes, there are. You would have to go through the chaplain services. They do have different religious articles, whether it's clothing, and things the chaplain has a book where you can order it. But it's for every religious faith. They have different things set up, and you go through religious services and they help you with all that.
Very cool. So our next question, do you think the prison system is now focusing more on rehabilitation and less on retribution? And then this person also added that this is the first place of incarceration that they've heard of somewhere that seems to focus more on rehabilitation. So
the federal prison system, like Ms. Morris said, the federal prison system is really good about the education and the rehabbing, as opposed to the state. It's probably, I guess, because it's different pots of money, maybe, I don't know. But that was one thing, especially as time went on in my 25 years, we got more into how do we decrease recidivism rate? Let's try to break this cycle. What do we need to do? And that's when they started with, the boot camp, and then RDAP, and then coming up with a staff member that helps them do a resume and helps them find a place that they don't have anywhere to go. Because like I said, you had some inmates that were homeless and they didn't have anywhere to go. So they would just commit another crime or violate to come back to prison.
Right.
Because you have food and medical care and a bed, and you don't have to worry about, you don't have that stress of being homeless.
Exactly. Awesome. So our next question comes from Mary, and she asked, how revolutionary was the First Step Act, which was intended to cut unnecessarily long federal sentences and improve conditions in the federal prison, and helping reduce long federal sentences and decrease recidivism in the eyes of someone like you who works closely with the federal prison program?
I know right before I retired, there was one, it might be that one that went through that they were having to go through everybody's sentence and reevaluate to figure out who it would affect. And some of the girls, I know it was immediate release. Some, it obviously meant they were releasing sooner. I know some of the ladies, they were having to get their attorney to go through to see if they were eligible for that. It did release quite a few of them, but same thing. If they didn't program while they were there and they hurry up and get out, they come back.
Exactly. And this one is kind of related. So this is from Olivia, and she asked, how are education opportunities different in a maximum security prison?
Well, Brian, where I worked, we had some of the most offered classes, whether it was programming when I was in recreation and the education side. Every federal prison has them. There are also courses you can get in the mail. I forget the name of the college, but there was quite a few ladies that would do those classes where you would do it through the mail, and they were college credit, but I forget the name of the college. The higher levels, they are given the same opportunity for education. Like I said, one thing that the Bureau is very big on is if you can't prove or you don't really have your GED, you have to get it while you're there. That they really want you to get that, because that has even proven, even with just that, because it makes you more marketable to get a job.
Right.
So.
Just out of curiosity, and you may not know this, have you heard of like how the education, like as far as college courses and college credit has changed with COVID and being online? Is it easier for inmates to get college credit, or do you know anything about that?
You know, because I'm not there now, I don't know how they're doing that with that. So inmates can get on the computer, but they don't have access to internet.
Right.
So usually the instructors from the local colleges would go in and teach. So I know a lot of things have changed with COVID for everyone. So I would probably say at the moment, I wouldn't be surprised if they've either done it through like a Zoom setup where the inmates are in class. That's probably what they went to.
Gotcha.
Would be my guess.
That makes sense. Awesome. So our next question, this person asked, what about sex offenders and child trafficking offenders? Are they treated differently than other offenders? And are there helpful rehabilitation or mental health programs specifically for them?
They do have that for offenders in that area. As far as if you're talking about staff, like if staff treat them different, I would say possibly yes. In my time at Bryan, we had a situation where staff didn't want to help this one inmate. We had to move her. We had to take her to another institution, and some of it was because of what she was in there for. That's not my place to judge you. My job is to make sure you're taken care of and you're protected, and you get the services you need. So I actually was one of the staff that took that individual to another prison. You have to take your personal opinion of what you think of them for their crime out of the equation, because you don't know the whole story. You don't know what went on, and it's not your place to judge them. They're paying their debt back to society by doing their time. But yes, I would say, especially at higher levels where they tend to have more especially male sex offenders and things, yes, I would say it's probably hard for a lot of people, because think about it. Even if you're not an officer, you're just a human being out in the community, and you know your neighbor is a sex offender. How would you feel? And how do you think they feel? So, I mean, it's hard. You just have to learn to take that out of the equation and not let your personal judgment affect how you feel about them.
Right. So going back to the topic on education that we touched on earlier. So this question comes from Lewis, and he asks, what was the average number of the women, and what was their education level on average, and what type of offenses were common?
Drug offenses are always the highest. That's in state and federal. That's always your highest crime, is drug offenses. I would say probably 50% of our population came in with no high school diploma or GED. It could be slightly higher. I would say it's probably higher than that. We did have one offender that it took her 10 years to get her GED. and you would have thought we all won the lottery because we were so worried, and she wanted to quit so bad, and we were her cheerleaders. And it's like, you've got this. And that's the other thing is with a lot of the, some of the offenders, they have learning disabilities that were never caught in the public school system. And I personally have learning disabilities. It's hard. It's really hard. Some things are really easy and some things are really hard. And when you're struggling, especially if you're like severely dyslexic, you get behind in school. Well, then what do? You drop out.
Mm-hmm. So this person is curious about how COVID is affecting incarcerated people right now. And like, for example, do they have to wear masks?
Yes, they do. And it's, I mean, that's even harder because with having COVID, you know, they've stopped visitation, I'm sure prison-wide, whether it's state or federal. Like I said, they have the phone and you have the computer because they have like a Skype type system, but it's not the same. It's not the same.
Right. So this might be one of our last questions. So this person was curious if you ever felt uncomfortable or scared in a situation with an inmate.
I actually had been assaulted once, and I had an inmate charge me, which is classified as assault on an officer. And I was actually pregnant with my middle son. I was about 4 months pregnant. And because I had been assaulted prior to that by an inmate, yeah, that that was, but I had 2 inmates that jumped in front of me when that inmate came flying at me. So I know when I first started, there was an older lady that was incarcerated that told the other cook foreman, they were like, she's just a baby. They're going to eat her alive. But I, you know, I didn't stop. I kept going. And, you know, there was lots of rambling on the compound when I got assaulted by the inmate because the inmate was pregnant. And so, yeah, there was a lot going on with that. If I was awful and I got called all sorts of names and it was hard, but yeah, that was a hard situation.
Right. So actually, it looks like we have time for one last question. So this person was curious about what ways students can get connected with helping out in correctional facilities in their area.
I know they always have volunteers to religious services. Education sometimes will have volunteers. I know through psychology sometimes they have students come in that are psychology majors. I know some of the inmates, I think there's like a pen pal website, but I wouldn't suggest that. I would say if you really want to help, I would get involved either through the education department, if there's an opportunity in psychology somehow to help, or counseling, or teaching. Something in that nature. You can always call the prison and find out, or get with religious services and see if there's an opportunity to help in that aspect as a volunteer.
Perfect. So unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you, Heather, for giving us your time and expertise. We hope to see you all back here for 3 more events that will take place during the spring semester. Please be on the lookout for more information in January. And lastly, if you all want to learn more about FPEP, feel free to write to us at fpep@furman.edu. Thank you so much. Good night.
Bye.